Okay, trying this again. Melville, Moby-Dick, lecture number 3, the land chapters, and introducing Queequeg. All right, you guys, I cannot believe how good your Moby-Dick posts were this week. And at the same time, it's totally believable and totally unsurprising. They're amazing. So thank you so much. Please keep this up, this level of reading. If you're reading this closely in these like confusing opening chapters when we're all trying to figure out who the heck Ishmael is, and maybe not even Melville knows where he's going at this point, you're really going to have the wind at your back, the wind at your sails, so to speak, when we finally head off to sea. So keep this up. All right, as I mentioned, scholars call these first dozen or so chapters the land chapters, drafts of which were written before Melville kindled his life-altering friendship with Nathaniel Hawthorne. And these compositional questions then arise. Why didn't Melville just go back and cut some of these digressions? Why didn't he go edit these things out? And like tighten up the novel, get to the main plot points a little bit quicker, more expeditiously, like maybe introduce, if your book is called Moby-Dick, maybe introduce Moby-Dick at some point in these early chapters. And he doesn't even quite do that. He talks about a white whale kind of vaguely at the end of chapter 1. Why didn't Melville go back and rewrite this thing so it flowed a little bit better? 2 answers to that. Number 1, the digressions are just too much fun sometimes. I'll give you an example that stands out to me that nobody really touched on in the comments that I saw. This is from the end of chapter 1. This is page 6. And really, basically, it's a little bit of one of these digressive passages, and he's making all these allusions to classical Greek culture, and you're like, what is he talking about? Why is this even in here? But it slowly dawns on you that he's actually making a fart joke. He's making a rather long-winded joke about flatulence, but he's also making like a serious point with it too. So here's what he says. This is on page 6. He says, Ishmael's explaining why he doesn't go to sea as a passenger, why he always goes as a sailor. And he says, finally, I always go to sea as a sailor because of the wholesome exercise and pure air of the forecastle deck. It looks like it's spelled forecastle, right? But it's forecastle. That's like the nautical pronunciation. He continues, for as in this world, headwinds are far more prevalent than winds from astern, that is, if you never violate the Pythagorean maxim, so for the most part, the Commodore on the quarterdeck gets his atmosphere at second hand from the sailors on the forecastle. He thinks he breathes it first, but not so. In much the same way do the commonality lead their leaders in many other things at the same time that the leaders little suspect it. Okay, let's unpack this, right? So imagine this stapler, you have to use your imagination, is a ship, and the ship is headed in this direction. And the sailors up front on the forecastle are violating the Pythagorean maxim. Now, the Pythagorean maxim is not a squared plus b squared equals c squared. It's not that Pythagorean maxim. It's a Pythagorean theorem. Pythagoras had told his followers not to eat beans. He'd forbidden his followers, this is like this cult, in the ancient world, don't eat beans. And why? Because beans are the musical fruit, and the more you eat, the more you toot. And so the sailors up at front are basically farting downwind, and the commodores, the captains who are back here, are just basically getting, as the ship is sailing forward, are getting all the sailors' flatulence. And that is how, the ship of society kind of moves along. So you can see there's a couple things going on here, right? He's like being jokey and talking about like his foregrounding his like classical learning and these kind of high culture jokes. But on the other hand, he's got a profound point here that those who think they are in charge, who are back here, are actually getting a lot of life at second hand, pre-digested, if you will. Some people, these people up here in the front of the ship, in the forecastle, are busy creating life, creating ideas, creating culture out of their experiences that they're imbibing. And these other people back here who are like busy trying to organize and control what others have created are really just kind of smelling their farts. Ishmael says he prefers to live up in the forecastle with the common sailors. He prefers to live with the vitality of a creator rather than taking life at secondhand, just encountering the kind of cultural productions, the books, the music, the movies, whatever it is that are like sort of the excreted flatulence of the people who are actually living life. You think about like a meme or something like that. A meme is vital and interesting when it starts, like among your friends, among young people. But then, of course, by the time the older generation catches wind of it, by the time your teachers or your parents are using it, it's kind of dead. Punk rock was really cool when we started playing it in our garages when we were 15. But then once it got on the radio, it's not like it's subversive anymore, and you got to go find something else. So that's the idea. Like it's this like digressive, funny fart joke, and it maybe gets in the way of the plot. We don't actually hear anything about the white whale until like the end of that first chapter. He talks about him as like a grand hooded phantom, like a snow hill in the air, but he never mentions the whale by name, Moby-Dick. We hear nothing about Moby-Dick. Instead, we get fart jokes. Like 100 pages in is finally when you hear about Moby-Dick, right? So, all right, that's the first reason for this digressive material, is that he's like showing off how fun and clever and talky and entertaining he can be, telling stories at the bar, essentially. The second reason he's doing this, like the more maybe profound scholarly reason, could be summed up. I've got a nice little quotation here, a nice little image from Andrew Delbanco from Columbia University in his book on Melville. Just listen to this quote. This is so wonderful. He says, and it explains what Melville's doing with some of these digressions. He says, Moby-Dick is like an active archaeological site. It's like an active archaeological site in which the layers of its own history are left deliberately exposed. That's really nice. Okay, so if you can imagine like an archaeological site, they dig down and then you can see the different layers, different histories, the Byzantine ruins on top of the Roman ruins on top of these other ruins. And you can just imagine the layers. And he says Moby-Dick was sort of written like that, where Melville left the layers of its composition exposed. He says, and he's quoting this other writer here, Norman Mailer, and he says, this is wonderful too. He says, a good half of writing consists of being sufficiently sensitive to the moment to reach for the next promise, which is usually hidden in some word or phrase, just a shift to the side of one's conscious intent. Right? It's like half of writing is like, here's the thing that I said, but then there's this other thing that's like just to the side of what I said. Now I'm going to like follow that. And then the thing to the side of that, I'm going to keep following that in this like digressive way. And then I'm going to leave it all open to the reader, like an open archaeological site where they can see this. And Delbanco says, quote, Melville was the first American to write with such outrageous freedom. He was the first to understand that if a literary work is to register the improvisational nature of experience, it must be as spontaneous and self-surprising as the human mind itself. How about that for Melville, right? The spontaneous, improvisational nature of experience, of consciousness. That's what Melville gains by leaving in these things that kind of leap from like connection to connection, digression to digression, until he kind of wraps it all up in like a surprisingly satisfying way at the end of these chapters. Like the Nantucket chapter is a great example of that. But that's what makes the digressions so fun and so challenging. And, I guess the word would be so digressive. We got to remember, right? Great books are rarely perfect books. The imperfections are part of what makes them alive. They have a beating heart within them. a human consciousness that is on the move. And that is messy and beautiful, but it's not like formally, all the right angles get squared away. It's almost as though Melville would like rather capture the spark and energy of human consciousness thinking and inspiration striking, even if he does it like imperfectly, than to capture, something kind of boring, like a tea party perfectly, like Jane Austen might be able to do. Nothing against Jane Austen. I don't know why I'm ragging on her. She's just like a good antithesis to Melville. She's brilliant. Go see Emma. It's amazing. The new movie out. But anyway, so great job with these, moving through those digressions. I thought especially you guys did really well writing about Ishmael's sense of providence and also about his attraction to water. One of the posts was so great that I just wanted to like quote it at length because I loved it. And there's a really important point in here to draw out a little bit further. So this is Carla's post. I wish I had time to like talk about all of your posts individually. I could do this with any, I could just pick a post at random, but sorry, Carla, your post was awesome. So here's what Carla said. Let me just read it to you. I copy pasted it here into my notes. Carla said, "I understand Ishmael's lust for being at sea, because when I'm out there, I get a sense of freedom with the vast seascape and the salty wind. Yet it's so peaceful being rocked by the powerful, unstopping swells. Just looking out at the ocean brings wanderlust because of the never-ending, mysterious, dark water that seemingly has a mind of its own." Oh my gosh, like Carla, Melville couldn't have said it better. She goes on, she says, "I think Ishmael starts to feel trapped on land because of its finite, slowly changing features. And that's when he takes to sea." So good, right? Can I just point out one key word among many amazing words that Carla uses here is the word finite, okay? She says, right, the finite land, slowly changing features. Okay, finite is a key word. The sea for Melville, and this is Carla's point, I'm just trying to draw it out a little bit more. The sea for Melville represents the infinite, right? It's the abyss. It's both attractive and beautiful and lures us, but it's also frightening because you could drown in it and you can get lost in it. You could lose your selfhood in it. There's going to be like more specific talk about this with the cabin boy named Pip in a few hundred pages. But look, at this point early on in these chapters, Melville just says that we are drawn to the infinite by its magnetic virtue. And so all the streets of Manhattan, or like any town by the sea, he says, if you follow them far enough, all the streets lead you to water, because that's just where we want to go as human beings. We want to live at the limits, if at all possible. And he makes this joke, like connecting it to philosophy, right? It's another one of these little digressions, poking fun at people who think too much about these things, even as he himself is like in the midst of thinking perhaps too much about these things. And he says, his joke is like, if you're ever thirsty and you need to find water, like if you're in the middle of the desert, just get yourself like a philosophy professor. He says a metaphysical professor, and just turn him loose and have this guy, of course it's a guy because it's the 19th century and only men are professors, but just like turn your philosophy professor dude loose and have him start walking, and he's going to lead you to water inevitably, almost magnetically, because meditation and water are wedded forever. And we're drawn to ask these infinite questions like the philosophy professor would, even though they make us look a little silly trying to wrap our finite minds around them. We just get so bored of finite land. The water is the infinite that philosophy always seeks and can never quite penetrate, that lulls us and draws us, but also could obliterate us. Keep in mind, those of you who studied the ancients, you'll remember this, that the first philosopher in the Greek tradition is not actually Socrates. It's an earlier guy named Thales. And Thales actually falls into a well at one point because he's gazing up at the stars and he doesn't see where his feet are going. And Thales, of course, becomes the butt of every joke about philosophers because he has to be like rescued by his housekeeper or something, somebody practical like that who can lift him out of the well that he's, fallen into as his head was in the clouds. And Melville is kind of like making this joke about philosophers being drawn to water and drawing on that. And how about this? Think of your life as like an island, maybe this kind of shape, right? And eternity is like the ocean that surrounds you on all sides. If this is you, if you're the island, as you grow, as you get bigger, as your mind expands, as your soul expands, there's more of you that touches eternity. There's more of the island shore that touches the ocean, right? Your shoreline increases as the circumference of your life increases, and your contact with eternity increases. This is sort of the life of the mind that the philosopher should live. And Melville thinks that we're at our best when we're living on that edge where like time and eternity meet, which is of course the present. That's the present moment, is where time and eternity meet. He doesn't think we're at our best when we retreat inland to maybe the past or to like finite problems, which become boring after a while. There's only so many, times that you can cut your lawn before you sort of get bored of it. And you're like, well, what am I even doing this for? And then you start asking these bigger questions. And he wants to remind you that we're drawn to these limits, to these edges, because this is where the finite and the eternal meet. That's the limit. That's the shoreline and we can always see maybe just a little bit beyond into the depths, but not very far. Actually, this is a Robert Frost poem. Frost says, we can see neither out far nor in deep. Maybe I should find that poem and put it in the notes because, yeah, it's a great Robert Frost poem. But, that our limits are very clear. I can maybe imagine like what I'm going to eat for breakfast tomorrow or what books I'm going to read over the summer, Lord willing. But we're really quite limited in how far into the future we can see, at least within the bounds of this life. And we definitely can't see beyond the bounds of this life, if there is anything beyond the bounds of this life. Yet that is where we're attracted to naturally, as like people are attracted to water, and that's where we have to live if we're going to grow, is at the edges, the limits, the bounds of these questions, which maybe take us to where like civilization ends and the wild part begins. So that's why Ishmael is going to take to sea. He'll do a lot more with this metaphor of like landlessness and the shore a little bit closer, a little bit later on. There's also this great passage on page 39, which I think was a little bit past where you guys read last time, but you'll pick up with this chapter this time, where he talks about oysters on page 39. And he says, yes, there is death in this business of whaling, a speechlessly quick, chaotic bundling of a man into eternity. I mean, that's a great description of death, right? A speechlessly quick, chaotic bundling of a man into eternity. But what then, he says? Methinks we have hugely mistaken this matter of life and death. Methinks that what they call my shadow here on earth is my true substance. Methinks that in looking at things spiritual, we are too much like oysters, having observing the sun through the water, and thinking that thick water the thinnest of air. Right? We're like oysters. We can't see very far. We tend to think that we see further and more clearly than we do, but our comprehension of the sun, right? And remember, the sun in Plato's allegory of the cave is the good, it's the true, it's the beautiful. Our comprehension of these things is not really any much clearer than an oyster's. The oyster knows the direction the sun is shining from, it's up, and the light that reaches it is real light, but it is distorted and is passed through these layers of water through our own limited perception. Somebody, I can't remember who it was, maybe Juliet, I don't know. I have to go back and see. Somebody was pointing out that a lot of the book has these like little moments that meditate upon perception. Maybe Amaya was pointing this out. I don't know. Somebody, too many good points to even keep straight. But that's here's the point, right? So much of the book is about perception, and it's about perceiving. And it's like that painting of the spouter inn, which draws Ishmael's eye because he has to interpret it, right? There is no like direct perception of it. He can't quite figure out what he's seeing. That's what draws him in. And I think life is a little bit the same. We're looking at it and we're trying to figure out what is going on here. What am I really seeing? And that's what sets us off on these philosophical. It's not denying that it exists. He's just saying what we get of it are these glimmerings that pass through objects and perceptions, and the truth is always mediated to us in time. And on this side of life, on this side of eternity, we're always going to be like oysters and talking about the sun. We speak of these huge matters, but we're just little bivalves, crawling around in the sand. Do oysters crawl? Maybe not. Too late to edit that out. Okay, moving on. Speaking of life and death, note the number of times that coffins come up in Moby-Dick, right? In the first paragraph, Ishmael describes himself as like bringing up the rear of every funeral he meets and pausing by coffin warehouses. And then the proprietor of the Spouter Inn is also named Peter Coffin. And, Ishmael draws attention to that last name before dismissing it. It's definitely not an omen at all that this guy's last name is Coffin, not in the least. No problems there. And, there's even like a chapter coming up. Maybe you saw it in the contents titled The Coffin, right? So just keep an eye out for coffins. Ishmael, as he's entering the chapel here, this is moving into the new readings a little bit, chapter 7, I think, on the chapel. He starts to notice all these grave markers on the wall. And this is before he sits down to listen to Father Mapple's very famous and justly famous sermon. And really, amid all of these reminders of death, all the coffins and the gravestones, these memento mori. Is that the Latin plural? Memento mori? I don't know. Somebody help me out in the comments. Amidst all these reminders of death, Ishmael is not just waxing philosophical about eternity, right? He's also really concerned with the stuff of life, with cash, right? With getting paid. What will compare with getting paid? He doesn't want to go to sea as a passenger or as a captain where he has to breathe the secondhand flatulence of the crew. A passenger has to pay. The captain gets everything secondhand. He wants to taste it all firsthand and get paid for it, right? He wants this unmediated experience of a simple sailor right before the mast. And yeah, this brings with it some being ordered about like a slave. That's inevitable when you go as like an ordinary sailor. People give you orders. But who ain't a slave, he reminds us. As Bob Dylan, David Foster Wallace, others have said, look, everybody's got to serve somebody. There's no such thing as not serving, as not worshiping. Everybody worships. So you may as well get paid for it. And if you're a slave to somebody else's project in life, so is everybody else. But even if you're not, somehow you're still a slave to fate, to chance, to time, to these forces outside of your control. So you may as well like get paid and enjoy some of what you can enjoy and endure whatever else you must endure and be a good stoic. And this is part of Ishmael's philosophy, at least to the outset of the book, when he's kind of like a young, brash guy kicking around looking to go to sea and make some cash. But there's a really important point tucked away here. There is something a little bit boyish and like charmingly immature about Ishmael. I'm not the first person to point this out. Let me read to you this quotation. It's from like its monumental book of criticism. It's called Love and Death in the American Novel. I mean, how's that for a title of your book? Love and Death in the American Novel. And it's by a guy named Leslie Fiedler. And Fiedler taught at the University of Montana, and that's really important. He didn't teach at Harvard or Yale or one of like the big Eastern schools out in Boston where Emerson and Thoreau were educated. Fiedler was like us. He was a Westerner. He was a Montanan. And that geography of the American West shaped his reading of American literature, which he thought, and he argued, was really a literature of the frontier, at least the American Renaissance writers, many of whom were men, let's be honest. They wrote about the literature of the frontier. Now, here's a quote. I'll read you this little quote from Fiedler, and you may recognize some other books that you've read here, Huckleberry Finn and Mark Twain's books. Fiedler says, quote, "The great works of American fiction are notoriously at home in the children's section of the library. Okay, and so he doesn't mean like they're written for children or they're written at like a childish age. He's saying that their themes are like kind of childish, even though they're these great works of fiction. Fiedler goes on. He says, quote, the typical male protagonist of our fiction has been a man on the run, a wanderer like Ishmael, remember? He says, Fiedler says, he's harried into the forest and out to sea, down the river, or into combat, anywhere to avoid, quote, civilization, which is to say, the confrontation of a man and a woman, which leads to the fall, to sex, to marriage, and responsibility. I'm still quoting Fiedler here. He says, one of the factors that determine theme and form in our great books is this strategy of evasion, this retreat to nature and childhood, which makes our literature and our life so charmingly and infuriatingly boyish. All right, that's the quote. Doesn't this help explain Ishmael's encounter with Queequeg, who's actually like one of the main characters from these land chapters who really sticks around throughout the whole book to the very end? So keep up with Queequeg, who he is and what he's about. Melville, remember, describes him as George Washington, cannibalistically developed, or something like that. So there's something kind of cool going on with Queequeg. And you start to realize it when there are a number of other characters from these early chapters who don't really stick around all the way through. Bulkington is one of them, the most prominent. You can't not notice Bulkington in these chapters, right? Ishmael's eating dinner at the Spouter Inn. A crew comes in. They've been at sea for 4 years. And like Ishmael spots this one dude out of all of them, and he's 6 feet tall, and he has a chest like a cofferdam, and his name is Bulkington. And Ishmael like makes a big deal out of picking him out, and then he's gone. And like you never really hear. We get like one other little mention of Bulkington, and this is one of the times when the text looks a lot like an open archaeological site where you can see where Melville had written it to go one way, with like Bulkington at one point being kind of the main hero of the book, not Ishmael. But then he kind of goes in a different direction, but he still kind of leaves Bulkington in there only to like bury him underneath other layers of the plot later. It's weird. Ishmael himself as a hero, like, he gets fragmented into 100 different voices around chapter 25. And yet Melville still doesn't go back and revise Bulkington out. You know, like if Miss Shotwell were Melville's creative writing teacher, she would be entirely correct to advise him to go back and get rid of this character if he's doing nothing to advance the plot. Maybe he belongs in an earlier draft. You toss him for the final draft. But Melville leaves it, and he does it on purpose. And it's digressive, but also instructive. He leaves the layers of his book exposed, like the layers of his psyche, as he's searching for that freedom of improvisational stream of consciousness writing, which is what makes the book at the end of the day so magnetically authentic, even if it breaks all the rules of like good formal fiction writing. I think Zachary Rice actually made a nice post about this, like Melville's digressive sentences and plot points that don't really go anywhere. There's too many nice posts to mention. This is going to be the theme of. Seems like he's set up as the hero. Doesn't happen. Queequeg and Ishmael. This is the ultimate like meet your roommate scenario, maybe nightmare scenario. If you are, going to college at some point and you got to like meet the person you're going to share like close quarters with for a while. I mean, hopefully you don't share a bed with your roommate in your college. That would be a very crowded dorm. But Ishmael is like a little bit nervous. He doesn't really like sharing a bed with anybody. That's why he likes being on a ship, because you get your own hammock. And he definitely doesn't want to sleep with like a dangerous harpooner. And he starts to hear these things about Queequeg, right? He carries a string of shrunken New Zealander heads around town with him, like they're a sack of onions. And Queequeg is like tattooed all over his face and body, and he shaves every morning with his like sharpened harpoon, which is like the coolest and most manly and intimidating thing you can imagine. And Melville even tells us that his harpoon has been intimate with the hearts of whales, and so his harpoon has been like baptized in whale's blood, and he's just like casually shaving with it in the morning. And Queequeg, the list goes on, right? He gets dressed backwards, like he starts with his hat and he's like naked all the way down, and then he goes and he puts everything else, and he puts his socks on last or something like that, right? Again, there is not maybe a whole lot of cultural sensitivity in this portrayal of Queequeg as like a cannibal islander, at least on the surface. But Ishmael ends up concluding that maybe it's better to hang out with a sober cannibal, a person of like character, in at least in his cannibal society, than a drunken Christian, the people that he otherwise could be sharing a bed with. And so he, Melville does sort of dig down beneath these layers of culture to get to something like, the man's character. And they do develop a fast friendship, Ishmael and Queequeg, in part because Ishmael is sick of civilization and like the hypocrisies of Christendom around him. And, he's drawn to the nobility and simplicity and like, physical prowess of Queequeg. He's the guy that you want at your side if there's an emergency on the ship. And they have this like totally weird night together, sleeping in the same bed, which Ishmael hates at first, but then he says he's never slept better in his life. And he wakes up in this like really profound and mysterious chapter called The Counterpane. I don't know if you guys were able to make much sense of that. It's still very mysterious to me. Melville gives us this great description of what it's like to experience your body as somehow like separate from your mind in those first moments when you're waking up, when you're like coming back into yourself, into your body, and your body and your mind don't quite gel together as they should in those first moments of awakening. And you realize that like you have this consciousness, but you also have this body, and they sometimes seem like they could float free of each other. And there's this remarkable description of the phenomenon of embodied consciousness in that chapter. And he goes back to his childhood to sort of describe it too. It's really something. It's a really remarkable chapter. There's lots of great readings of it that are maybe too complicated for us to get into in like a YouTube video. But of course, the context of this very profound meditation on embodied consciousness is this humorous incident, of these two kind of beefy sailor men who are cozy in bed together, sleeping, quote, as if I were his wife, Ishmael says at one point. And it's just funny, too, to imagine these dudes in this posture. And, you can think of like whatever sort of buddy comedy, bromance movies, there's always like an element of the guys who are really close, but then maybe a little too close. And you're like, and it's funny. I just have to point out that here that it is kind of a buddy comedy at this point, which tend to be fairly masculine. Even the like female buddy comedies like Bridesmaids or something like that from a couple years ago still tend to follow a lot of, critics think these very masculine formulas of like what friendship is. And it's worth pointing out here that other than like maybe one chapter, maybe the Chowder chapter that you're about to read, there are exactly 0 women who like appear on stage in Moby-Dick. I think maybe Ahab has like a wife at home who's alluded to off stage, but really for most of the book, it is just dudes. It is dudes sailing together in a giant wooden ship, having so much fun, like throwing harpoons, somewhat phallically perhaps, like doing dangerous things that, stereotypically no woman around to like civilize them would approve of, because women, of course, ruin all of our macho dude fun and all of that stuff. Do you see where I'm going with this? Not that this is true, but this is Fiedler's thesis in Love and Death in the American Novel. He says that, American literature is, remember this, premised on male immaturity, on our boyishness, which requires the missing feminine other. Women have to be sort of like off stage in order for this to like take place. If you guys have ever read, if you're fans, I know some of you, we've talked about this, are fans of the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes. Actually, this is a good Sloka year to mention Calvin and Hobbes, because they're named, of course, after two Enlightenment thinkers, John Calvin, who we talked about last time, and Thomas Hobbes, who wrote a book called Leviathan, which, of course, is quoted in the extracts of Melville's Moby-Dick, which is, a Leviathan is a big whale, but for Hobbes, it's also the government, the state. But look, in Calvin and Hobbes, the comic strip, if you are fans of that, Calvin has this treehouse club, and the club is called GROSS, and it's an acronym, GROSS, which is an acronym for Get Rid of Slimy Girls. I think the last S in gross is like the S at the end of girls. It doesn't quite work, but it's called GROSS, Get Rid of Slimy Girls Club. And it's supposed to be this really juvenile, kind of funny, Calvin's like a little boy and he thinks that girls have cooties. He's not mature enough to treat them as human beings yet, because he's 7 or whatever. And Fiedler in Love and Death in the American Novel suggests that American literature, serious American literature, like Moby Dick, is just as boyish in a weird way as the boy who's in his treehouse and no girls allowed. Because women represent growing up, they represent responsibility. And if we can set out for the West, or if we can go to sea, then we won't have to confront adulthood and love and responsibilities that come along with those things. And we can live like Peter Pan forever, and we can just eat steaks and smoke pipes and talk about philosophy with no women around, to nag us into domesticity. I mean, you can see there's this deeply sort of casually misogynist, maybe more than casually misogynistic strain in this idea that American literature is sort of like a frat club a little bit, a fraternity, a boys club. And you can see that Fiedler is saying that this is maybe problematic. That maybe Moby Dick is problematic in this vision of American life as excluding, a female experience and participation. You could say, on the one hand, that Ishmael and Queequeg's Bromance is inclusive and multicultural in some ways, because it transcends their kind of cultural differences, but it's also exclusive and maybe narrow-minded in other ways, in that there's no girls allowed. Some scholars have used the term homosocial, kind of a really helpful term, homosocial, to describe this kind of frat boy bond between Ishmael and Queequeg, meaning that, you prefer to socialize with somebody of the same sex. You're like a guy's guy. So, homo, same, social, socialize, homosociality. Other scholars, however, think that there are actually maybe more sort of sexual overtones here, in a way that there's something always a little bit strange, a little bit odd, maybe even a little bit queer, about excessive displays of homosociality, where you have these over-the-top performances of hypermasculinity that maybe call attention to, by negating these desires that can't really be spoken or named in a particular social context, like 19th century New England, where you couldn't really talk about this stuff. So I don't know what to think about that. That's just, the status of where current scholarship is with Ishmael and Queequeg. And really from there, their relationship is a lot, less intimate and less complicated. And they're just bros. But those opening chapters are really strange and funny. And maybe there's something more going on there. I don't know. That's probably all I can say about it. If you guys have any insights into Ishmael and Queequeg's bond, help me out. I will also point out that there are, to defend Melville here, there are several very profound, very pro-feminist readings of Moby Dick out there, even though it has no women in it. We're going to explore this eventually. Maybe the feminine in Moby Dick are these maternal bonds that are exhibited by the whales and by nature itself, which is presented as at once healing and very powerful. Transcendent and overall quite sympathetic and feminine, in contrast to the hunters and the harpooneers on the ship, who are presented basically as barbaric and rapacious, hyper capitalists who are killing things for a paycheck, and they're just these oceanic death dealers who sail around killing stuff. So so Melville might be critiquing those male harpooneers by presenting, the feminine other as nature that is bigger and smarter than they are in some ways. So there's lots of like Moby-Dick is like anti-feminist, and lots of like Moby-Dick is pro-feminist. I don't know. It depends on how you read it. You guys decide, but keep those thoughts in mind. One other question to keep in mind going forward, or like maybe another way of putting that question, right? Is Melville celebrating masculinity in these dudes, Ishmael and Queequeg, or is he critiquing it? Is he celebrating their friendship, that like these guys can like bond, or is he saying that like, well, they're the kind of guys who can only bond with other guys and who are immature and who don't know how to like relate to women? Probably a little bit of both. He's probably both critiquing it and celebrating masculinity at the same time. As in the Chowder chapter, Melville frequently wants to have it both ways. You know, they want to have the fish chowder and the clam chowder, and you don't want to choose. You want to like eat both bowls of chowder. Some of you are like, yeah, of course you would have both bowls of chowder. Why would you just get one bowl of chowder? Melville agrees with you. You know, there's all these points throughout the text where Melville wants like to bring in the pagan perspective and the Christian perspective. He wants belief and he also wants unbelief. He wants God and he wants nothingness, and he wants them in the same breath. And as a reader, it's kind of up to you to decide what this vision is that he's offering that maybe doesn't fall into any of our prefabricated binary categories. And you got to decide like whether he pulls it off. When he does, it's amazing. When he doesn't, it's like, you know, a little bit humorous anyway. Remember, again, always that this is a book at the end of the day that is about bigness. It's about transcending our ordinary categories. And he's going to use these literary devices like symbol and illusion and ambiguity and Ishmael Queequeg stuff and metaphor and all of this to, in a sense, invoke the unsayable. He's going to try to like stand at the very edge of the water, which is the limits of our perception. And he's going to try to like speak about what's beyond. And that's part of the adventure too. Okay, this is getting kind of long, so we'll end there. That's the start of the land chapters. Maybe I'll make another video here shortly on Father Mapple's sermon. Maybe I'll save that for next time. I don't know. The sermon does fall into this like really specific genre that we're going to call the American Jeremiad. It's a prophetic genre of like American preaching that is still like widely used in a lot of reform movements today. We'll get into that next time. Just to recap this lecture then, the land chapters, they're digressive and fun, but also kind of like this open archaeological site where the book's composition and the author's consciousness are both on display in all of their full, unapologetic, you know, glory and freedom. And Melville is again interested in limits, in perception, in striving for eternity and transcendence within our mortality and finitude. He's interested in masculinity and male friendships. He's suggesting maybe that two men, even if they're separated by thousands of miles culturally from like Boston to Hawaii, maybe those two men have more in common than like a man and a woman who live next door in the same New England town because of their like, you know, gender divides. But maybe he's also critiquing that. Maybe he's critiquing that culture of homosociality, perhaps by digging deeper into the inherent queerness of it, perhaps by setting up nature in future chapters as a mysterious and powerful feminine other. There's a lot of stuff going on in these early chapters that we could talk about, but you guys are doing so good. Take a look at some new questions and the new reading assignments and keep going with that. And as you're reading on, be on the lookout for coffins. Lots of coffins. I've got a coffin joke. Maybe I'll tell you the coffin joke next time. Okay, we'll see you guys later to talk about prophecy and preaching and Father Mapple's sermon on the book of Jonah. Thank you for listening and following along. Have a lovely, lovely evening.